The invitation had been ceremonial, a parchment-bound gesture, sealed in gold, passed through guarded hands more for show than purpose. Uther Pendragon, king of Camelot, had not expected a reply, especially not from Avalon. Their kingdoms shared no warmth, not in treaty, not in trade, and certainly not in blood. Centuries ago, Pendragon blades had slain the dragons bonded to Avalon's royal line, severing power from soul. What followed were generations of frost, in diplomacy, in weather, in the very bones of the land. The last time an emissary from Avalon stepped foot in Camelot, a storm nearly split the castle in half, but tradition demanded all suitors be invited when a royal heir came of age. And so, suitors were summoned for Princess Morgana's hand, knowing full well most would decline. It was a political courtesy, not an open door, yet a raven arrived bearing the seal of King Balinor. Avalon had accepted the invitation. Uther had read it 3 times. Then once more aloud, in a tone as sharp as the blade he kept beside his throne, "They are sending Prince Merlin." The name silenced the court. Even Morgana raised an eyebrow over her goblet. "The mage?" she asked. "The one who burned through the northern coast in his trial year?" "The same," Gaius murmured, "ever the adviser, the heir to Avalon, the next dragon lord." Arthur scoffed. "A warlock prince. How romantic." Uther's gaze flicked to him. "You'll be present when he arrives." "I'd rather not. I wasn't asking." Prince Merlin arrived on a cloudless morning, robed in deep blue and laced with dragonbone silver. His magic pulsed faintly around him, humming like a storm trapped beneath his skin. He didn't ride a horse. He glided beside it, hovering a foot off the ground, just to be contrary. Probably. Arthur stood at the top of the castle steps, arms crossed, watching. Their eyes met. Merlin smiled, slow and arrogant. Arthur felt something cold twist in his gut, or maybe it was heat. He didn't like it either way. "You must be Prince Arthur," Merlin said, voice like honey over blades. "I thought you'd be taller." Arthur descended 1 step. "You're exactly as irritating as I imagined Avalon's pride to be." "Good. You imagined me." Merlin's grin widened. "We're already halfway to courtship." For the next week, Merlin did everything but court Morgana. He debated Arthur over breakfast, sparred with him in the yard, and magically reorganized the Pendragon library just to fix its atrocious cataloguing. He seemed particularly fond of appearing wherever Arthur went, be it balconies, stables, or war councils. Always armed with a smug quip or carefully veiled insult that left Arthur bristling and off balance. To everyone's surprise, it was Morgana who seemed to enjoy his company most. She, who was constantly surrounded by pompous alpha suitors with rehearsed smiles and overinflated egos, found in Merlin a rare kind of reprieve. He never tried to impress her, never postured or sniffed the air, or talked over her as if she were an audience. He treated her like a person, someone who was sharp, clever, and perfectly capable of making her own choices. They started spending afternoons in the gardens, sharing dry observations and laughter laced with secrets. Merlin's wit matched hers, and his magical knowledge intrigued her, but there was no pull, no alpha-omega hum between them. Just respect. Arthur endured it, barely. "Why is he still here?" Arthur demanded one night, throwing off his ceremonial cape with force. Morgana didn't look up from her wine. "Because he's not actually here for me." Arthur froze. "Excuse me?" She smirked. "Oh, come now. He flirts like an archer with a grudge. And you blush like a maiden." "I do not blush." "You glow then, like a candle about to set something on fire." Arthur gritted his teeth. "He's an alpha. So are you." "That's exactly the problem." Merlin, for all his snide bravado, wasn't faring much better. He'd expected the Pendragon alpha to be brutish, predictable, someone he could tolerate from afar while fulfilling his diplomatic duty. What he hadn't expected was Arthur, golden, proud, every bit the infuriating alpha stereotype Merlin despised. Yet he was all that but with an underlying honesty that the others lacked, and not to forget that the Prat was maddeningly beautiful. It was probably a curse of his lineage. Dragon lords had instincts, deep and old. His had awakened when he turned 16 and summoned Aithusa, his first dragon. Since then, he'd been taught discipline, balance, control. But none of it helped when Arthur's ridiculous mouth curled in a half-smile, or when he stormed across a training yard with his hair damp and his tunic sticking to his chest. Merlin hadn't meant to want him, but want him he did, with a force that scared him more than the war he'd once fought against Sidhes. His instincts whispered, mate, protect, claim, but logic screamed louder, no heirs, no legacy, no future. If he did this, if he ever gave in, then it would cost everything. Avalon needed a ruler, not a reckless prince tangled in Pendragon sheets. And yet, when King Senard touched Arthur's shoulder a tad too long, Merlin nearly incinerated the man on the spot. That wasn't logic. That was fire, and it was rising. Thinking about it now, Merlin could trace the beginning of the end to one thing: Arthur's low, amused laugh, the kind that made Merlin's chest clench and his instincts snap like a taut string. The suitor from Wessex, Prince Urien, had been polite enough, respectful, measured. But it was his older brother, King Senard, who behaved like he already owned the court. He stood too close, let his hand linger too long on Arthur's arm, and smiled like he had a right to it. Most missed it. Senard was an alpha too, after all. His posture read like confidence, not arrogance. But Merlin saw through it, saw the calculation in every glance, the challenge in every word. Merlin had no issue with Arthur being admired. He had every issue with Arthur being touched. Relax, Morgana murmured, slipping beside him with a sly smile. You're practically growling. I'm not, Merlin snapped. He was. His magic flared warm under his skin, pooling in his palms like fire barely restrained. He didn't look at her. He couldn't, not with the way Arthur's lips curled, golden in the firelight, head tipped back in something dangerously close to delight. The sound of it burrowed into Merlin's bones. He exhaled sharply. 3 weeks earlier, Merlin had arrived in Camelot with a mission to evaluate Morgana as a potential bride and discreetly gather intelligence. What followed had been something entirely different. A blur of half-arguments and near-flirtations, of accidental brushes and purposeful proximity. He debated Arthur over breakfast, sparred with him in the training yard, and corrected the Pendragon Library's cataloging system just to irritate him. He showed up on balconies, in war councils, at stables, always pretending it was coincidental. It never was. Arthur matched him move for move. Every glance between them came laced with tension. Every exchange teetered between bickering and banter. Neither of them said anything, of course. That would make it real. Instead, they walked in wide circles around the truth and met at its edges, again and again. Sometimes it was in the stillness after a duel, when their breathing sensed and neither stepped back. Other times, it was the quiet talks after court, where Arthur let Merlin see the man beneath the armor, the one who carried the weight of a future kingdom in his calloused hands. Merlin told himself he was being strategic, that knowing Arthur made it easier to understand Camelot's weaknesses, that he was gathering intel, yet his hands always stilled when Arthur laughed, his thoughts scattered when Arthur grinned like they shared a secret. He didn't want to understand Camelot anymore. He wanted to know Arthur. They both pretended not to notice what was happening. They pretended it wasn't a kind of courtship. It was easier that way, but Merlin knew, he had always known. And now, watching Senard inch a little too close, that laugh curling in the air like smoke, he felt something old and dangerous stir in his bones. He wanted Arthur to laugh like that for him, only for him. The mating moon rose that night, an ancient, sacred time for claiming rituals and binding vows. The triple goddess temple stood quiet and shimmering beneath the stars, its white stone glowing faintly with ancestral power. Merlin hadn't meant to go there, but Arthur had. They met in silence, the air between them so charged it could have scorched earth. You're avoiding me, Arthur said, folding his arms. Is it because of Urien, or because I'm getting under your skin? You've been under my skin since the moment I saw you, Merlin admitted, tired of pretending. And yes, I'm avoiding you. For your sake. Arthur stepped forward. Why mine? Because I can't do this, Merlin hissed. I can't want you. I can't claim you. You're an alpha. I'm heir to Avalon. Our bond could ruin everything. Our legacy. The fragile alliance. Arthur's voice was quiet. Or it could breathe a new life to our kingdoms. Dissolve the animosity. We could stand together, build a stronger kingdom. And then he looked at Merlin. Those impossible blue eyes, vulnerable and stubborn and full of something reckless and real. Merlin didn't remember moving. Only the moment when his mouth crashed into Arthur's, and the world narrowed to heat and lips and teeth, and the thrum of ancient power, sealing a bond beneath moonlight and dragonfire. The claim settled over him like armor, like home. And then, What in the name of the gods is this? Uther. He stood in the arch of the temple, face pale with fury. Arthur froze. Merlin did not. He stepped forward, protective, but it was too late. Guards dragged him away. Warded chains snapped around his wrists. A spellbinding rim swallowed him whole. Deep beneath the castle, Merlin sat still, magic blistering behind his ribs, shackled by wards older than the kingdom. "You fool," he whispered to himself. "What have you done?" Far away in Avalon, Kilghara, the great dragon of Kin Balinor, felt the tremor ripple through the bond. His eyes snapped open, gold and furious. King Balinor was in council when Kilghara landed, shaking the stones of the eastern spire. The dragon bowed its head only slightly. "Your son is in danger," Kilghara growled. "The Pendragon king seeks to break him. Will you do nothing?" Balinor rose. "Ready the army. We march at dawn." But they weren't the only ones moving. Senard, taking advantage of the chaos, launched an ambush on Camelot's outer walls. The siege hit as the morning broke. Smoke curled into the sky. Soldiers fell, and Arthur, leading the front, was struck with a poisoned arrow. In the dungeons, Merlin screamed as Arthur collapsed on the battlefield. He felt it. The pain, the bond. The alpha rage took him. The wards shattered. He flew through the castle, magic in his wake, and descended upon Senard's forces like a second sun. Fire raged. Ground split, and the dragons answered. Balinor's forces arrived just as Merlin rose above the field, eyes glowing, cloak scorched, Arthur's limp body in his arms. He didn't look like a prince, he looked like a god. Balinor watched, stunned, then nodded once. "To arms. We stand with Camelot." The battle ended with Senard defeated, his men routed, his ambitions crushed. Arthur barely survived. When Merlin laid his hand on Arthur's chest, something ancient unlocked. Magic flowed, slow and golden, and Arthur breathed. The impossible had happened, and Merlin refused to let anyone near them. He guarded Arthur's bed like a beast, snarling at healers, snapping at knights. No one touched him, not until Arthur's hand twitched. Then Merlin crumbled, forehead pressed to his, whispering, "Don't you dare leave me now, you stubborn dollop head." Later, when Uther and Balinor observed the sleeping pair in the tent, the air hung heavy with old grudges and older regrets. Kilghara loomed behind Balinor, silent and watchful, his presence a reminder of everything they had lost. Smoke curled from his nostrils, heat rising from his scales like the breath of a buried past clawing its way forward. Uther didn't look at him. He didn't have to. The regret in his eyes was reserved for his son. He looked to Arthur, pale and unconscious on a cot. Merlin curled protectively at his side, like instinct made flesh. For a moment, Uther said nothing, then he exhaled. "Do we still have a choice in this?" "No," Balinor said. He didn't gloat. He simply sounded tired. After that, they sat together, and talked. Uther rubbed at his temple. "I trained Arthur to rule. Carved the softness out of him when Ghigraine died because I thought he'd need the steel. Maybe he did. But now I wonder if it was ever enough." His voice lowered heavier. Morgana was supposed to be an only child. Arthur was a miracle, conceived by a druid's blessing, and for the longest time I hated him for it. Hated the magic that gave him to me and took Ghigraine in return. Balinor watched him, silent. I blamed him. Uther admitted, resented his smile because it looked too much like hers. Until he fell ill one winter, cold as the grave. And it was a sorcerer who saved him, who gave me back my boy. Let me see him laugh again. Gods, that smile. He shook his head, as radiant as hers. He let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. When Morgana's visions began, they nearly destroyed her. She'd collapse in seizures, screaming prophecies no child should carry. It was a witch who sealed the magic inside her, who spared her from a life spent drowning in it. He exhaled. That was when I knew. Magic wasn't the enemy, just what we made of it. "I never trained Merlin," Balinor said, voice rough. "Spent his childhood chasing dragonfire, trying to preserve what little of our kind was left. I thought I was doing something good, something lasting, and I told myself there'd be time to come back for him." He looked away. "But then, Huneth got sick, and I wasn't there." Uther didn't offer pity, just quiet understanding. "You kept them alive. I passed on what I could when no one was watching." Balinor huffed. "It wasn't enough." Uther's answer was bitter, final. "It never is." Their gazes met across the brazier. She still believed he'd change the world, Balinor added, quieter. Even if it broke him, Igraine thought love would fix everything, Uther said. She died believing that. For a long time, neither man spoke. The fire between them snapped. Then Kilghara flinched. It was subtle, just a shudder of his wings, a ripple in the air. But the silence shattered around it. His eyes flared gold, bright enough to light the tense dark corners. He growled low, ancient magic coiling through his body like a storm caught behind his ribs. "What is it?" Balinor stepped toward him, alarm rising like a tide. The dragon's voice rumbled, distant and thunder-heavy. "I see a path. Splintered but whole. Albion. Not ruled by one, but balanced by two. Blood and light, fire and stone." Kilghara's head turned toward Merlin and Arthur. "There is hope," the dragon said softly now. "A kind not born of crowns but choice." Balinor's chest lifted, something like belief catching in his breath. But Uther only frowned, the creases in his face deepening. "Visions change," he muttered. "And hope is a dangerous thing to put in the hands of boys." Kilghara said nothing. The bond had been sealed. The war had been won. And the future, for better or worse, had already. Senred was dragged through the ruined gates of Camelot in chains, bloodied but defiant. His once polished armor was smeared with ash and shame. He still smirked when he was brought before the high court. "Their lies," he snarled. "I gave no order to march. It was Urien, my brother. He plotted this," the court murmured. Even Uther's eyes narrowed. "Urien of Wessex has always been noble," Uther said slowly. Senred spat on the floor. The throne room doors opened with a thud. Prince Urien strode in, his arm bandaged with a silken cloth, deep violet, unmistakably the color of Princess Morgana's house. He didn't bow, didn't greet. He simply walked to the center of the room and faced his brother with all the composure of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I happened to be near Princess Morgana," Urien said, voice cool, "when one of your royal guards tried to attack her." A murmur swept through the court. "I stopped him," Urien continued, lifting his bandaged arm slightly. "Before he could strike, he claimed you gave the order." Senred's gaze flickered, not enough to notice, unless you were watching closely. Merlin was. "Do you deny it?" Urien asked. "I deny everything," Senred said with a dry smile. Urien didn't flinch. "Then I present witnesses. Members of your own guard who surrendered to Camelot. Letters bearing your seal. Your plans to claim Albion by force." Senred lunged. He moved with the speed of a serpent, dagger drawn, aimed for Urien's heart, but Morgana had already moved. Her dagger sang across the court. Clean. Swift. Right between Senred's ribs. He fell to his knees, dagger clattering uselessly. Silence echoed. Urien stared at her, breathless. Morgana glared down at him. "I don't miss," she said coolly. "Especially not for treacherous cowards." Urien swallowed. "Remind me not to cross you." Morgana smirked, and the weight of the crown fell squarely on Urien's shoulders. By the next morning, he had sworn the oaths, been named King of Wessex, and sent peace offerings to Avalon and Camelot. Though he might have offered Morgana a flower first. She took it, but only after making him sweat. Up in the royal chambers, Merlin hadn't moved in 2 days. Arthur lay pale but breathing, chest rising in shallow rhythms. Merlin sat at his bedside, one hand splayed across Arthur's sternum as if anchoring him to life itself. No one dared disturb them. Not when the air still shimmered with residual magic. Not when Merlin snarled at anyone who stepped within arm's reach. "This is madness." One knight muttered outside, "He's acting like a feral beast." "He's in a bond rage," said another. "Don't be stupid." They both fell silent when Arthur coughed soft and real and alive. Merlin was already there, pressing water to Arthur's lips, brushing hair from his brow, murmuring, "You're here? You are okay." Arthur's eyes fluttered open. "You think I'd let you win that easily?" Merlin exhaled a laugh and promptly burst into tears. Below, Uther and Balinor sat in the council chamber, maps and treaties strewn before them, the scent of old wine lingering in the air. "We must secure a formal alliance," Uther said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Now that Senred is dead and the bond between our sons cannot be reversed." Balinor nodded, agreed. "Avalon will recognize the claim." But Uther added darkly, "Arthur cannot afford to forget what he is. The crown comes first. His duty is not for you to define anymore," Balinor said sharply. "He is not a boy, and Merlin is not your enemy. Uther stared into his goblet. He could be. If he ever breaks my son's heart. Alinor's eyes narrowed. Then you do not know Emrys clan that well. Back in the chamber, Merlin leaned against the bedpost, exhausted. Do you feel it? He asked softly. Arthur, eyes still bleary with sleep, blinked up at him. Feel what? The magic? Merlin said. I healed you. Me. I've never been able to do that before. Not like this. Arthur reached for his hand. It's the bond. Merlin nodded. It's deeper than I thought, stronger than anything I've ever known. Arthur's fingers twined through his. Good. Then it'll hold. Merlin looked at him then, truly looked, and realized with bone-deep clarity that this was only the beginning. They had claimed each other. Now they had to claim the world that came with it. Arthur had never felt so tethered, not even in the days following the war, when Camelot's walls had shaken and Senarn's army poured through the forests like smoke. Not even then had the crown felt so heavy. He stood now in the round tower of Avalon, Merlin's home, looking out over a foreign but beautiful land, filled with lush valleys, crystal lakes, and rivers humming with old magic. He could clearly hear the echo of voices from council halls, Avalon's court still murmuring with tension. He understood the discord. Merlin had claimed him, the hated prince of Camelot, not just in the sacred rites under the triple goddess temple, not just in body or bond, but in public, in politics. The world had shifted on its axis, and Arthur Pendragon wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Down below, in the high court of Avalon, the nobles had already begun their whispers. Prince Merlin, one counselor said disdainfully, is devoted. Yes, but hardly objective. He has no stomach for law or legacy. He's clever, added another, but he spends more time with healers and scholars than governors, and now he lets a foreign alpha in his kingdom. And in his bed, no less. The insult lingered in the air like smoke. Merlin stood in the center of the chamber, spine straight, face unreadable. He wore Avalon's royal blue, but his shoulders bore a new kind of strain. He said nothing, but his magic flared, just enough to silence the murmurs. Still, the damage was done. Later, Arthur found him in the palace garden. Merlin was kneeling beside the lavender bushes, sleeves rolled, dirt under his nails. He didn't look up. They think I'm your puppet, he said. Arthur hesitated. They're afraid. They think I listen to you more than my own court. Arthur crouched beside him. Do you? Merlin met his gaze, eyes tired but affectionate, not blindly. Arthur wanted to kiss him, but instead, he sat beside him in the dirt and plucked a weed from between the stones. I've been thinking, Arthur said quietly, about heirs. Merlin froze. Arthur continued, if I ascend the throne, if we do this properly, our kingdoms will expect an heir. God's willing, the united Albion will need one. Merlin's jaw tightened. You want to undo the claim? No, Arthur said at once. Never. But I'm worried, for our kingdoms, for what we'll have to sacrifice. Merlin swallowed. I've thought of that too. Our gender might make it impossible, but even if it does, there are other ways. Heirs don't always have to be blood. Arthur nodded, slowly. But our people won't see it that way, not at first. They sat in silence, the scent of lavender heavy around them. I'm not a ruler yet, Merlin said finally, nor a diplomat like you, and frankly, I would rather teach children how to speak with the wind than debate tax law. Arthur smiled faintly. And that's why they love you. Merlin looked up. Even if I'm a fool. Arthur reached for his hand. Especially if you're a fool. The court integration began in full force the next week. Avalonian ministers were stationed in Camelot. Camelot's knights trained with Avalon's mage guard. Trade lines were redrawn. Laws debated. Tensions rose. And Arthur stood in front of both courts and spoke, for the first time, of a dream he had barely dared name aloud. A united Albion, he said, voice steady. Not just peace but permanence. An alliance bound not by fear but by loyalty, strength, and shared purpose. The bond I share with Prince Merlin is not weakness. It is proof that we can stand as one. Some scoffed, some clapped, others simply watched. Merlin stood to Arthur's side, eyes unreadable, shoulders squared. And for the first time, he understood what they truly were. A symbol, not just of love or defiance, but of a new world. A fragile one, and he would fight to protect it, even if it meant learning to rule. Even if it meant standing in court and letting them question his heart. Even if it meant carrying Arthur's burdens, and trusting Arthur to carry his. The Avalon wind was different. It carried scents of salt, sage, and something older, magic woven through the roots of the land. Arthur inhaled it as his horse trotted along the path to the lakeside village of Hallithorpe. His Camelot guards rode behind him, but he wore no crown today, no Pendragon cloak. Just a simple tunic, a steel sword, and the weight of a world learning to see him as more than a foreign alpha. The people were wary at first. A Pendragon in Avalon? The whispers echoed behind windows and between stalls. They remembered the wars, the sharp Pendragon conquest, the burning of mage shrines in old times. But then Arthur stepped off his horse and knelt in the dirt beside a sick farmer's child. He carried her to the healer's hut himself. He listened to a widow complain about rising taxes. He visited every village well, every granary, every market. And he remembered every name. In 3 weeks, Avalon began to soften. So did Arthur, but not in the way anyone expected. Back in the palace, Merlin watched it unfold with quiet awe. Arthur returned to him each evening with dust in his hair, ink-stained fingers, and stories of problems solved before the council could even draft them. A broken irrigation system fixed by recruiting out-of-work mages. A drought-handling plan based on weather charms. A tax adjustment modeled on a fisherman's desperate math. Merlin watched, listened, and finally understood what had always been true. Arthur Pendragon wasn't just a crown or a claim. He was a vision, brilliant, ruthless, tireless, and absolutely not the boy Merlin had kissed under moonlight. But he was the king Avalon needed. "I see it now," Merlin admitted one night, curled in their shared bed, voice a whisper. Arthur looked at him over the candlelight. "See what? Why people follow you. Why even the council is starting to respect you." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying I've won over your scheming old mages?" Merlin gave a quiet laugh. "I'm saying you're more than they expected. More than I expected." "Does that scare you?" Merlin rolled onto his back, staring at the canopy above them. "No, but it makes me wonder what I'm supposed to be next to you." "You're the reason they still trust the throne," Arthur said. "I make hard decisions, but you remind them why those decisions matter." It became their unspoken balance. Arthur became the firm spine of Albion's budding unity. He passed reforms that hurt in the short term but saved in the long one. He closed a corrupt temple. He dissolved a noble family's illegal monopoly. He denied an old friend's request for land and cried behind closed doors afterward. Merlin watched each decision chip away at Arthur's gentleness, and shielded him from losing it altogether. He took to walking the gardens, sitting with orphans, laughing with healers, visiting mages with failing powers. He listened, held space, and soothed unrest with small kindnesses. Where Arthur burned, Merlin cooled. Together they began to rule. Still, it wasn't without cost. Arthur snapped once, mid-council, when an Avalonian lord accused Merlin of being a soft-hearted pet alpha. "Say that again," Arthur growled, rising slowly from his seat. "And I will remind you that Pendragon steel doesn't need magic to gut a traitor." Merlin had to calm him with a touch to the wrist. Later in private, Arthur admitted, "I thought ruling would be glory, victory. But it's just pain, Merlin. Choice after choice that feels like a wound." Merlin leaned into him. "That's why we do it together." For the first time, Arthur believed it. And across the ocean, Uther Pendragon stirred uneasily. When word reached them of his sudden illness, Arthur and Merlin returned to Camelot by dragonback. Kilghara was less than thrilled. The ancient dragon grumbled with every beat of his wings, muttering about indignities and heavy passengers. He only flew because Merlin asked him to, and even then, his flight was full of unnecessary turns and stomach-lurching dips over the sea. Arthur clung to the saddle, jaw clenched. "Is this thing trying to kill me?" Merlin, annoyingly relaxed behind him, smirked. "Be nice. He is doing us a favor." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "You sound like you are enjoying this. You sound like you are enjoying this." "I am," Merlin said, and took the opportunity to wrap an arm securely around Arthur's waist. "Just making sure you do not fall. Would not want to lose you to the waves." Arthur stiffened, caught between fear of plummeting and the far more dangerous sensation of being held that tightly. It was safer not to think about it, not to acknowledge how Merlin's presence made him feel steadier than the saddle ever could. Merlin, of course, felt everything. His magic hummed beneath his skin, ready to catch Arthur if Kilghara tried anything. The dragon had no love for princes. But he tolerated Arthur for Merlin's sake. And when they finally landed in Camelot, Kilgara muttered something about soft-hearted fools, and vanished into the clouds. Uther watched their return from his sickbed, eyes tired but sharp. He saw the difference in his son, but Uther only worried. He had known love. And he had known what it cost to lose it. He remembered Igraine's laughter, Morgana's cries when her visions tore her apart, Arthur's silent frozen grief after her power was sealed. Uther had once cursed Arthur's birth, resenting the magic that made it possible. It was not until he nearly lost Arthur to cold and fever that he accepted help from a sorcerer. Not until Morgana nearly died from the weight of her visions that he begged a witch for a solution. Both times, magic had saved what mattered most. Still, Uther feared. That evening, Arthur stood in the war council and, with quiet authority, told his father to rest. "I will take the throne as regent until you are well," he said. "There is no need to strain yourself further." There was no argument. Uther looked at him for a long time, something heavy and unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded, leaned back against the cushions and let go of the reins. Arthur carried them with surprising ease. Later, Uther found Merlin beneath the stars. "If you die," he said, "you will take him with you." Merlin said nothing, because he had no plans of dying. It started with a map. Arthur stood before the massive war table, now a peace table, and marked trade routes in bold red. The once fractured borders between Camelot, Avalon, and Wessex had become arteries pumping wealth and stability. Grain flowed from the plains of Wessex to the hungry in Camelot's outer provinces. Mages from Avalon repaired roads and enchanted fields, making harvests bloom. It was working so well that even the skeptics were stunned. Arthur never smiled at the victories. He noted them and moved to the next fire to put out. The crown didn't weigh him down anymore. It had become part of his spine. What did weigh him, though, was the fear of complacency, of slipping, of letting Merlin down, because Merlin was still the heart. When unrest flared in outer villages, it was Merlin who appeared barefoot and cloaked, listening as if every word were scripture. When orphans cried at the temple gates, Merlin was there with books, laughter, and magic tricks. When an elder mage passed, Merlin helped burn the incense and stayed up all night writing eulogies. Where Arthur governed with law, Merlin ruled with love. Together, they made something no kingdom had ever seen, a realm that functioned and felt. But there was a cost. Arthur and Merlin returned to Avalon after Uther recovered to take the Camelot's throne, resuming their effort of slowly integrating the two royal courts. "He's thinning," Balinor remarked over breakfast, watching Arthur scan reports. Merlin blinked. "He hasn't had more than 3 hours of sleep in 5 days. He won't stop," Balinor said. "Not unless you do something." Merlin looked down at his tea, guilt threading through his thoughts. He hadn't wanted to interfere. Arthur was brilliant. He didn't need hand-holding. But slowly, Merlin was beginning to see the cracks. Arthur wasn't sleeping, but he was dreaming, restless, shuddering dreams that left him cold and gasping. He smiled in public but never at himself in the mirror. And when Merlin kissed him, he melted, but only for a second before he returned to duty. Things came to head at the spring festival, with King Uther visiting the kingdom of Avalon for the first time. He finally said what Merlin couldn't. Uther cornered him on a palace balcony at dusk, arms crossed tight against the rising wind. "You think the threat is outside," Uther said. "Centered, rogue nobles, spies." Merlin didn't respond. Uther's voice lowered. "But the real danger isn't what happens if Arthur fails. And I have already said this before, it's what happens if he loses you." Merlin stiffened. "I'm not going anywhere." "You already have," Uther said. "You've let him carry everything, and you think being the gentle one is enough to protect him." He turned away, jaw tight. "It's not." Merlin's magic prickled like frost beneath his skin. Uther's words were almost scalding, but not wrong. That night Merlin watched Arthur sleep. He wasn't thrashing, not this time, just lying too still, like a soldier waiting for the next command even in slumber. The candlelight flickered across his face, casting hollows under his cheekbones. Merlin reached out and touched his hair, whispering, "I'm sorry," because Uther was right. Merlin had chosen to be the shield. The smiling face that protected Arthur from the emotional toll, but in doing so, he had left Arthur alone in the cold. He had let Arthur believe the burden was his alone to bear. But it wasn't. Not anymore. "I'm coming with you tomorrow," Merlin said at dawn. Arthur didn't look up from his armor, to the council or the border site. Both. Arthur frowned slightly. You hate border sites? Doesn't matter. He gently caressed the dark circle beneath his mate's eyes. I won't just be the one they cry to anymore. I'll be the one making the hard choices with you. He stepped closer, voice firmer now. But you have to let me. Stop trying to protect me from the worst of it. That's not what we are. Arthur blinked, and something softened behind his eyes. I didn't want to force you to do something you hate, he said. I won't, Merlin replied. But I will hate myself if I let you suffer to spare my emotions. From that day, they changed again. Arthur still shouldered the kingdom, but now Merlin stood beside him, not behind. He took seats in policy meetings, challenged tax decisions, stood his ground with nobles who had once laughed at his soft voice. And when Arthur faltered, Merlin was the steady pillar beside him. They fought more politically and personally, but they also laughed more. They disagreed in council chambers and made up in gardens. Merlin kept Arthur grounded, and Arthur kept Merlin moving forward. Together, the sword and the shield became indivisible, and Albion stood stronger than ever. Soon a new era of united Albion began. It did not start with a coronation or war. The new era began quietly, when two figures stood side by side in the Hall of Unity, not to demand allegiance, but to offer a future. Arthur wore Pendragon red, the lion crest gleaming on his chest. Merlin wore the flowing dark blue of Avalon's mages, silver threads curling like dragonfire at the hems. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. Their bond hummed in the space between them. They didn't rule as two kings. They ruled as two forces. Arthur, the sword, unyielding, calculated, born for burden. Merlin, the shield, nurturing, protective, the people's soul, and somehow together they made it work. Balinor watched from the high seats, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He had once feared the bond would cost Avalon its future, that his son, a scholar and warrior, would be eclipsed by Camelot's unrelenting need for conquest and control. But the son who stood before him now was not eclipsed. He was illuminated. And Arthur, stoic, sharp-tongued Arthur, had changed too. Not softened, but refined. Honed into a leader who could see more than land and legacy. One who carried his people's hunger in his bones, and made sure no corner of Albion went unheard. Balinor exhaled slowly. For the first time since the bonding, he was grateful for the alliance. Uther Pendragon, however, stood in the shadows of the hall. Gaze hard, mouth a line carved from granite. He didn't speak as others celebrated. Didn't join the lords and ladies who toasted to peace. He watched Merlin whisper to Arthur, with a small smile, watched Arthur lean slightly toward him. Always slightly, like gravity worked differently between them. There was strength in their unity. That was undeniable. But there was also risk. Uther had known love, and he'd known what happened when a Pendragon lost it. Still, he remained silent, because he had also known power, and what it meant to let go of control for the sake of something greater. The first law of Albion was written in both High Speech and Old Tongue. It granted mages equal political voice. The second law expanded inheritance rights, allowing chosen heirs regardless of bloodline, opening paths for future rulers, no longer bound to Alpha-Omega norms. The third law outlawed border skirmishes, and ensured each province had a seat at the Unity Council. These weren't the laws of one man, or even two kings. They were the laws of a future forged in fire and tempered by love. At dusk, after the final council meeting of the season, Arthur and Merlin sat alone on the balcony of the Camelot Avalon Palace. A sprawling structure built on what was once no man's land. Now the heart of Albion. Below, children played near the reflecting pools. Merchants lit lanterns strung between stalls. Laughter rang out, mingling with the song of distant harps. "We've done something impossible," Merlin murmured. Arthur sipped his wine. "That seems to be our pattern." Merlin turned to him. "Do you regret it?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. His eyes were on the horizon, where the sun bled into twilight. "I regret the cost," he said finally, "but not you. Never you." Merlin reached for his hand under the table, fingers brushing knuckles. "You don't have to carry the regret alone." "I know," Arthur whispered. "And that's why I can keep going." Together, they made plans for the spring. A library city to be built in Avalon. A knight's code updated with a clause protecting bonded pairs. A new druid sanctuary in the northern woods. Their love was never paraded, but it was never hidden. It simply existed, like stone and sky. Like dragonfire and the sea. And as the stars flickered into place above them, Arthur turned to Merlin, his voice low. "We've built something real." Merlin smiled. "Not just a kingdom, a home." And beneath them, Albion breathed, alive, united, and enduring. Epilogue, Year 5 of Albion's reign. Albion was no longer a dream scribbled in scrolls and speeches. It lived now, loud and sprawling, fragrant with magic, ringing with dragon calls, and clashing opinions. The old court still whispered, disapproving of the new laws and stranger customs, but they whispered from the sidelines. At the kingdom's heart stood two kings, Arthur and Merlin, their portraits hanging side by side in the great hall, one with a sword at his side, the other smirking with glowing fingertips raised mid-spell. Spring brought the fertility festival, a week of chaotic blessings, awkward dances, and poetry so questionable it made Merlin physically wince. Still, he sent an invitation to Wessex with a flourish. Morgana arrived days later, glowing and sharp-tongued, several months pregnant with her second child and refusing to be pampered by her besotted husband, King Urien. She stomped into court in riding boots, cursed a noble who tried to comment on her ankles, and kissed Merlin on the cheek. Despite the festivities, Arthur stood on the palace balcony one evening, wine in hand, eyes distant, as bells rang faintly over the city. "The kingdom thrives," he said quietly, "and still something feels unfinished." That something arrived the next day. An 8-year-old alpha, fierce, and swinging a wooden sword, like she had been born for it. Gwen, daughter of the late royal blacksmith, marched into the kitchens, declared Arthur her favorite king, and force-fed him turnips. When he tried to send her back to the village with a gently worded speech, she narrowed her eyes. "You're mine now," she said flatly. Gwen never left again. She argued with stewards, won battles over dinner seating, and once demanded an armed escort to her reading lessons. Uther watched her march past one day, then turned to Arthur with a faint smirk. "She has the makings of a Pendragon's son." Balinor, meanwhile, had declared himself retired from all forms of governance. These days, he wandered the palace barefoot, in gauzy tunics, sipping wine and muttering about the spiritual purity of moss. He coaxed roses into blooming with whispered poetry, and insisted the palace gardens had sentience. Surprisingly, Uther got along with him. The once stern Alpha King now spent his afternoons with Balinor, seated in matching chairs, bickering over court gossip like old sisters. "I hear the elven delegation arrived early," Uther muttered one afternoon. Balinor hummed, stretching like a sun-drenched cat. "They brought fermented dew. Said it opens the soul." "You said that last time. I woke up in a tree." "You needed the perspective." Together, they were a walking disaster. They once sparked a diplomatic incident by spreading rumors that the Griffin ambassador had proposed to the Goblin Queen. It wasn't true, but the resulting mess led to a lucrative trade agreement, so no one complained. Dragons were everywhere now. Tiny ones nested in chandeliers. Larger ones circled the skies over farmland, watching crops grow. Balinor wept the first time one curled around a crying child to shield them from a storm. "Magic returns," he whispered. Arthur had accidentally adopted 6. At least, that was what he claimed. "It followed me home," he said about a scrawny purple runt with lopsided wings. "You carried it in your cloak," Merlin replied, unimpressed. They were cold. The dragons adored Arthur. They nestled in his boots, draped over his shoulders, and snorted smoke when anyone raised their voice around him. They were his honor guard now, fierce, loyal, and entirely unreasonable. Merlin tried to enforce rules. Magical contracts, ward boundaries, feeding schedules. Arthur smiled, then slipped a dragonling a pastry under the table. He looked hungry. Perpetually unimpressed, Kilcara called Arthur a soft-headed fool. Still, he always offered Arthur rides, even when Merlin stood nearby, with a packed saddle and crossed arms. "No," Kilcara said. "Your magic is annoying today." Gwen, of course, bonded with Aethusa. The two were inseparable. Gwen wove flowers into her horns. Aethusa blocked corridors so Gwen could stage ambushes on unsuspecting nobles. Together, they redirected palace guards for rescue missions, and once declared the Western Tower a dragon-only zone. After the festival, Uther and Balinor took it upon themselves to educate Gwen in matters of rule. This involved leading magical toads into the war chamber, enchanting a tapestry to sing scandalous lullabies, and insisting that Gwen's tantrums were character-building. "She's your future queen," Uther said proudly, stroking the magical cat on his shoulder like a smug crown. "She's going to set the council on fire," Merlin muttered. "She's aiming higher," Balinor replied, winking. Arthur, meanwhile, sat nearby peacefully, drowning happily under the 3 dragons, draped around him like fur-lined scarves. Merlin had given up on complaining after the dragons incinerated an assassin hiding beneath their bed. "See?" Arthur said, cradling a sniffly runt. "Protective instincts. I hate it when you are right about something," Merlin had sighed, before going on a rampage to discover the one who had sent the assassin. The palace often felt like a fever dream. Sentient furniture, legal petitions from centaurs. A troll recently won a merchant seat by popular vote. A shapeshifter who had assumed the identity of a brownie worked in the royal kitchens, turning out miraculous croissants. One noble tried to protest and was cursed with hiccups every time he lied. The court ruled it fair, but amid the madness, there was always Arthur. Somehow the years had made him more grounded, more patient, more alluring. His touch, always sure, now lingered with affection. His eyes softened whenever Merlin entered a room, and Merlin, who had once braced himself for possible loneliness, now found his arms constantly full. As for Arthur, he truly believed that Merlin was his heart. When Arthur was a boy, Uther had trained him with steel in hand and stone in heart. "No man is worth your tears," he had said, time and again, teaching him to bury softness beneath armor, to mourn only in silence, and never for long. Arthur had believed him, had lived by it through loss and war, holding grief in check with clenched fists and quiet nods. But the first time Merlin broke under the weight of magic, duty, and a kingdom that pulled at him from all sides, Arthur had held him through the storm and said, voice thick, "You are worth my tears." Merlin had stilled against him, fingers curling in the fabric of Arthur's shirt. "Don't say that," he whispered, but Arthur only pressed a kiss to his temple and murmured, "It's forever true." Later, when Merlin kissed him, fierce and breathless, with magic spilling from his skin like light, Arthur tasted salt and devotion. "You are worth my tears." You would say it again if asked, again and again. Their chambers were a sanctuary. When the door closed and the kingdom faded, Arthur would pull Merlin close with gentle hands, pressing a kiss to his brow, then his lips, then lower, his mouth on Merlin's throat, murmuring praises like confessions, and turned Merlin liquid. They would tangle together in silk sheets, slow and reverent, as though trying to memorize each other again. Sometimes, they made love soft and quiet, letting the world fall away. Other nights, Merlin would push Arthur into the mattress, marking his soft thighs, coaxing sounds from him he never made for anyone else. He made sure that he claimed his pratty alpha heart, body and soul. Arthur would curse, then whisper his name like it meant safety. Afterward, Merlin traced the old scar on Arthur's hip, bit the flesh of his bottom, kissed the curve of his shoulder, and pressed his palm to Arthur's chest, feeling the steady thrum of his soul. Here, still here, always, they were still kings, still warriors, still builders of a new world. But in the hush of their room, with dragons curled at the foot of the bed and moonlight spilling across rumpled sheets, they were simply 2 men who had loved and survived, and who would love again, always. And so, Albion shifted, strange and shimmering. The old world creaked under the weight of the new, reshaped by magic, mischief, and love that refused to be small. No one, especially not the kings, would ever call it boring. Albion, it seemed, thrived best in absurdity.